So the purpose of this video is to talk about when we would use quadrant one only when we're graphing. We talked earlier about slope-intercept form, and we're familiar with graphing lines. And we know that beginning with section 4.1, we're going to go ahead and start with what they call linear equations. But specifically, the only real new skill you're learning in this section is that sometimes you only graph in quadrant one. So let's figure out why that is. So we learned previously that there are some equations such as, let's say, y equals 2x. And we know that our slope is 2 and our y-intercept is a constant. And if there is no constant there, then we start at the y-intercept, or in other words, this is what we call direct variation, right, or a proportional relationship. So anyways, we rise 2, 1, 2, run 1 every single time, and we have a line that goes to the origin. It looks something like this. And I know I'm not drawing perfectly, but you get the idea, right? It could look like a table. So our table can be going either horizontally like this, where we go at -2, and at -2, what's our y? We can plug in -2 and see we get -4. Or we can look on the graph. We go over -2 and -4. But one point of this lesson is just to talk about when these points here, when we plug these into a table, or we use our slope-intercept form, or we look at our graph, the point is that these relations always form a line. So this is what we call a linear equation. But what we're learning today is, what we're learning new about today, is that sometimes we don't do our x and our y coordinates. Sometimes we just stick with this quadrant one. We don't make our x and our y like a big T. We just use this part of our x and this part of our y. And long story short, the reason that is for eighth grade math, it's pretty safe to say that basically, if you're dealing with a word problem, you will stick with quadrant one. Think about what I just said. If it's a word problem, just use quadrant one. So if you guys had to graph this equation I showed you just a minute ago, y equals 2x, then you know you're going to draw your T like that. But if they give you a word problem, and it may still be linear, but if it's a word problem, then we only focus on quadrant one, right? Not 2, 3, or 4. So word problems, stick with quadrant one. Now let's think about why that is. So for example, most of our word problems either have time or money in them. So we use the most commonly used units of measure there, time and money. Let's say we're talking about time. As time goes on, we can see our x is growing bigger. But what if I went this way with time? We would go back in time? That wouldn't really make sense, would it? So that's why with word problems, we'll stick with quadrant one. So we can still have an equation such as, let's say, y equals 10x, where x is our hours, represents something now. It's not just some abstract idea, some imaginary points on a graph, right? And y represents something, our dollars. We'll talk what to call these, some fancy names for these in our next lesson. Okay. And so once they start meaning stuff, then we'll stick with quadrant one, but we can still make a table. Look, and I'll make my table vertically this time. This is my X, or my dollars. That's my hours, excuse me. This is my Y, my dollars. So as time goes on, as 1 hour goes on, if I'm making $10 an hour, I have $10. As 2 hours go by, I'll make $20. 3 hours go by, I make $30. And on a graph, if I were to graph these points, remember, we go side to side first and then up and down. So I go over 1, up 10, over 2, and again, this part right here should be review for us, okay, over 3, up 30. But what we're looking at is that our points always make a line, so it's what we call linear. And notice that we only use quadrant one. And for this problem, notice that I did not, this is another new skill from this lesson, I didn't put arrows on this side, did I? Because if I put an arrow right here on this side, that would mean keep going in this direction, and the negative direction are going back in time. So again, when we're talking about word problems, we have to be careful here. Stick with quadrant one and don't put arrows on the end over here, okay? So let's go ahead and take another look. So here's another example of how we can have, let's say, even a negative slope and have it still be just in quadrant one. So let's say I had a barrel full of water, right? There's water in there, and there's a hole got punctured and the water's pouring out. So that would be a situation where you'd have a negative slope, right? We talked about slope a long time ago. let's say that water is pouring out 10, let's see, water in gallons. Okay, I'm assuming this says gallons over here. 10 gallons per hour. Okay, so our X is hours and our Y is amount of water in gallons. Okay, so this is an X, not a T. Sorry about that. Okay, so if no time goes by, let's say that there's 40 gallons starting in the tank, that would mean we would start out with 40 gallons. Remember, our y-intercept is our starting point. It's this part right here, right? And so as no time goes by, there's 40 gallons. All of a sudden, let's say someone pokes a hole in this container here and water starts pouring out. So after 1 hour, if it's leaking 10 gallons an hour later, 10 gallons are gone. 2 hours later, 10 more gallons are gone. We're just subtracting 10 every time, right? And when we're subtracting the same amount every time, this is what we call linear, or it will make a line for sure. And after 4 hours, it's all gone. So that would look like this if we were to plot our point: 0, 40, 130, 220, 310, and 4, 0. So you can see we can still graph in quadrant 1, and notice I didn't put an arrow over here. And in this case, I wouldn't put an arrow here either because all the water drained out, right? So a couple new skills today we learned. 1, if it's a word problem, we stay in quadrant 1. 2, sometimes we don't always use arrows at the end of our graph. And 3, we just kind of reviewed what linear means because we did talk about that earlier. All right, so I hope that helped you guys out.